Hi, guys. In our previous section, we were discussing how energy flows throughout an ecosystem. So we looked at models like food chains and food webs to help us better understand how that energy flows. Today, we're going to focus on how matter cycles in and out of an ecosystem. So we're going to be focusing on some of the important abiotic factors that living things need to survive and how those abiotic factors are going to be moving in an environment. The first cycle we're going to focus on is what we call the hydrologic cycle or the water cycle, since all living things are going to be dependent upon water. So, what happens with any one of these cycles is that it's going to be a continuous circular pathway. So, it doesn't really matter where we start any one of these cycles. So, with the water cycle, we might start up here at the clouds. Water is going to fall to the earth in the form of precipitation, and it will move into various bodies of water or it will flow underground. Then, as we move throughout this cycle, we'll see that evaporation will occur, or what we call transpiration, where water is going to be evaporating from the leaves of plants, where it will move that water back up into the atmosphere, where it can once again condense and fall back to Earth. And the cycle will continue over and over. We're going to look at other biogeochemical cycles as well. So we're going to be focusing on how various chemicals that are important to living things will be flowing through the biological and geological parts of an ecosystem. So we're going to focus today on oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and we'll just briefly talk about how each of these chemicals are going to be flowing. The first one we're going to take a look at is the oxygen cycle. So we've already talked about photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and I hope you guys have a pretty decent understanding of both of these chemical reactions. So photosynthetic organisms will release oxygen as a byproduct. Then organisms that go through aerobic cellular respiration will take in that oxygen, releasing carbon dioxide that the photosynthetic organisms will use once more, and then this cycle will continue over and over. The next one we're going to take a look at is the carbon cycle, since carbon is a building block for all life on Earth. So when we look at the carbon cycle, keep in mind that carbon's going to be moving from the atmosphere through a food web, and then it will be returned to the atmosphere once more. So carbon will be emitted through the burning of fossil fuels. And just like we saw with the oxygen cycle, carbon dioxide is going to be used by photosynthetic organisms. Then the organisms that undergo cellular respiration will be taking in that carbon. Then through the decomposition of these organisms, we will see that that carbon will once again be turned into fossil fuels that can be burnt and transferred back up into the atmosphere. And the cycle will continue over and over. Now, some carbon is going to be stored for long periods of time in areas called carbon sinks, but then that will eventually be released back into the atmosphere and it will go through the process again. It'll be returned right back into the cycle. So that's the carbon cycle. The next one we're going to take a look at is what we call the nitrogen cycle. And most of this cycle is going to take place underground. So what will happen is that bacteria, they will convert gaseous nitrogen into ammonia through a process called nitrogen fixation. So at the roots of plants live these nitrogen fixing bacteria. And what we find happening is that ammonia is going to be released into the soil and it'll be transformed into ammonium. Then the nitrogen moves through a food web, as you see here, as various organisms will be eating the plants, and then it will be returned to the soil through decomposition. And the process will start over with the nitrogen fixing bacteria, and it'll move continuously throughout an ecosystem. Then the last one we're going to take just a quick look at is what we call the phosphorus cycle. And similar to what we saw with the nitrogen cycle, most of this cycle takes place at and below ground level. So phosphate is going to be released through the weathering of rocks. Then phosphorus is going to move through a food web and return to the soil through decomposition. Again, very similar to what we saw with the nitrogen cycle. Then the phosphorus will be leaching into groundwater from the soil, and it'll be trapped in sediments. Then over many, many years, through geologic uplifting, those rocks will weather once more, and that phosphorus gets put right back into the cycle. What we find with mining and agriculture is that typically those processes are going to speed up the phosphorus cycle. So it'll release phosphorus much faster into an environment. And again, with any one of these biogeochemical cycles, it's important that all of these are happening at a constant rate within an ecosystem so that living things have access to all of the abiotic factors that they need to survive. So that's it for this section of notes. In our last section, we're going to talk just a little bit about how both energy and matter is distributed within an ecosystem. And then that will wrap up our chapter, guys.